of Hafrashas Challah, part 2. We dealt with if you had somebody like an employee in the home, the Tzurba M'Rabanan said that they would not be able to take challah for you. So while the status of a domestic employee is subject to some controversy, Yalkut Yosef argues that a kashrut supervisor should take for granted that he has license to separate the challah even without explicit permission. Right? Mashgiach kashrut ha'oved b'mafiyah. This is the Yalkut Yosef. You have a mashgiach who works in a bakery, who mafresh challah, and he's the one who takes the challah. Yachud gam levarich ala farshas challah. He can make the bracha. Shebevadai balabayit noten lo reshut lakach. The owner is giving him explicit permission. V'mashgiach yotzei v'nichnas b'tadir. He goes in and out, like a mashgiach has to go in and out. V'i afshar sheyesh sham b'chol isha v'afiyah. And he's not physically present for all the kneading and for the baking. Yitzave lepoalim Yehudim. He can instruct the Jewish workers lahafresh mikol isa v'isa laniach betzad. He's to separate from each mass of dough and separate challah and put it on the side. Uchshiyachzor, when the mashgiach comes back and there's a whole bunch of challahs that have been separated, yikach kol ma shefrishu. He takes what they all were mafresh, v'yisrof, and then he burns the challah. We're going to learn because all kohanim are tameh today, so you can't give it to the kohen for him to eat it, so you burn it. And we'll learn about how to burn it today. Another eitzah is for the mashgiach to physically separate challah in the morning from the big original dough in the morning, which they did kashir chiyav afrashas challah. Vayomer harezu challah ala isa v'ala soor v'ala kemach shenishtayer. He says this should be challah even for the doughs and the flour that remain. Uchshliatasek kula isa achat, and later on, an isa is going to be made out of them. Tiskadish zu avidi l'shem challah. This challah should also be the challah for that dough. Oh, another eitzah shemasner shetochla challah afala kemach sheyisari v'achar b'shas aricha. Or the challah should also, any dough that flour that's going to be mixed later on, and he should burn the challah only after he's done everything. Some say that the mashgiach should say, "Hareini mafresh challah zu al kol ma sheyesh kan." I'm being mafresh challah on everything that's here. Ve'al kol ma shekvar nilosh v'nefa etel zeh nachtun. Everything that's been already kneaded and baked by this baker. And v'lo yifrish menu challah bein al ma shadayin be'en v'chol makom shehu bein al kol ma shekvar necha. Even for things that are existing wherever they are, and even for things that have been eaten already. So they want to cover all the bases. So thus far, we have discussed who is qualified to separate challah from the perspective of the relationship between the person performing the separation of the kneaded dough. However, there are other considerations in determining who is licensed to separate challah. For instance, may a minor, a cotton, separate challah? It seems for the Mishnah and Trumos that this question is subject to machlokas tanoi concerning separating truma, where one person holds that a child may never do so, while the other Tana holds that a child who vows, means if he understands the nature of taking the dorim, which begins at 11 for a girl and 12 for a boy, can separate truma, and the same would apply to challah, since the two generally have the same halachic status. It says in the Mishnah and Trumos, cotton shalohiv stays Cyrus. You have a cotton, he's not reached physical maturity. Rabbi Yehuda omer trumaso truma. Rabbi Yehuda says if he separates truma, the truma is a good truma. Rabbi Yossi omer imachlo balana is Nedorim, Ein Truma so Truma, if he has not reached the stage of making the Nedorim, Ein Truma so Truma. Umishabal is the Nedorim, Truma so Truma. So according to Shulchan Aruch, the halacha is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, that a minor who is capable of vowing is licensed to separate truma, and his or her act of designating the item is considered a halachically valid act. Says Shulchan Aruch Yoreh Shin Lamed Aleph, Koden Shigil Oines Nedorim. He's reached the age of making Nedorim. Avu Bishloevi stays Cyrus. He's not physically adult. The Lonasa Godel. Im Toram Trumaso Truma. If he separated Truma, the Truma takes effect. As opposed to a minor whose status is subject to some dispute, it is clear that a Gentile cannot act to designate Truma. There's a different mission in Trumas. Chamisha lo yitromu. 5 individuals can't give Truma. V'im tarmu, if they did, ain't Trumas and Truma. Nachri shetarmas shel Yisrael. A Gentile takes Truma from a Truma of a Jew, a filu b'rshus. Even if the Jew gives him a reshus, can't make a Gentile a shaliach for you. Ain't Truma so Truma. So as in many other areas of halacha, the same halacha applies as well to a mummer, one who violates the Torah as a volitional act of rebellion, or one who wantonly and publicly desecrates Shabbos. Thus, Truma or Challah, separated by such a person, would not be valid. The Mishnah Berurah discusses some of the details as to who is defined as a mummer. We discussed this at length in volume 5 when we learned about Yayin Nesach and Stam Yena. Anyways, the Mishnah Berurah here in Shin Pei Hey says, Ol Chal Shabbosos B'Farhesya, if somebody publicly desecrates Shabbos, the Oven Zechomer Kama Ovid Avodah Zarah, violating Shabbos in public, he says, is a sin on the level of Avodah Zarah. Shenasa b'zeh mumel chol Torah. You become someone who denies the whole Torah. V'dafka b'shirogil ba'avon zeh, somebody who's used to this sin. Aval chila Shabbos b'chad zimna b'farhesya, person who just violated Shabbos once in public, lo mikri mumah. V'yeshonim dafilu b'chad zimna mikri mumah. And what's ufarhesya? Keshechila b'fnei asor miYisrael. Somebody violated Shabbos in front of 10 people. Oh, sheyeda shetisparsim b'neim, or he knows that the information is going to spread among Jewish people. V'dat d'chol zeh kishu over l'te'avo. This is a person who violates Shabbos not for religious reasons. He's not revolting against Hashem. He's doing it for pleasure purposes. Wants to go to a ball game. Wants to go to a barbecue on Shabbos. Avalahachis. But if he's violating Shabbos on purpose to make Hashem angry, then then we don't necessarily have to, it's not just violating Shabbos. Afilu b'shara veros, eating chazer, eating nevela, any kind of lav. If you do it because your intent is to rebel against Hashem, then afilu shelo b'farhesya dino kagoy. Even if you did it privately, not in public, the din of such a Jew is kagoy, and that has halachic ramifications for all the things we studied tonight. For example, giving challah or truma, and of course all the other things we learned about, like yayin nesach and stam yayin. Okay, what about separating challah on Shabbos and Yom Tov? Chazal prohibited a number of activities on Shabbos and Yom Tov as metakein, correcting, a creative act that corrects a problematic status. Although these acts do not otherwise constitute a malacha, a forbidden creative labor, strictly speaking. So in light of this approach, Chazal also forbade the separating of Trumas and Maestros and Challah on Shabbos and Yom Tov, because you're metakein the dough. You can't use the dough without doing this correction of taking the Challah. So because Chazal prohibited being mesakein on Shabbos, so they prohibit you from giving Trumas and Maestros and Challah on Shabbos and Yom Tov as well. And we find it in the Rambam in Hilchos Shabbos, Chav Gimel, Ein Magbiin Trumas and Maestros. You cannot take Trumas and Maestros from your produce on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Shezeh Domel Magdish Oson Perosh Yifrish. You're consecrating those things that you were mafresh. That's number one. The order they should come sakin osan b'Shabbos. You're correcting the tevel, which otherwise could not be eaten. And the Shulchan Aruch follows the Rambam. Lo mafrishin trumas u'maisros. We don't separate trumas and maisros. The Mogen Avraham.
Would that be called makim apatish then?
It's misakin.
I know, but would it be makim apatish because that would be a derisa.
No, it's not. It's a rabbinic. It's a rabbinic issue.
No, but you're making it. It's ushered now, and then you're making it permitted to eat.
So that's misakin. That's misakin, and that's a rabbinic prohibition. Makim apatish means completing an act, like you hammer in the final nail. That's what it means, makim apatish. Or you take a hot metal sword that has to be annealed in cold water to harden it. So if you put it in cold water, that would be a makim apatish.
You're making something that's not permitted. 5 minutes ago,
it's not completed, and you complete it. Here, you're being misaking, like it was explained here, and that's only a rabbinic prohibition. The Mogen Avraham in his commentary on the Shulchan Aruch invokes the Rambam's second reason that such actions resemble misaking, and the Mishnah Berurah notes that separating Challah has the same status as separating Trumas and Maestros. Says the Mogen Avraham, V'lo mafrishin, the dami l'misaking. And the Mishnah Berurah in Yoredeya, in Or Chaim Shin Lametet says Trumas and Maestros v'hu adin Challah. He specifically says Challah would be prohibited to separate Shabbos and Yom Tov. What happens if someone did separate Trumas and Maestros or Challah on Shabbos despite this prohibition? So according to the Mishnah Berurah, if one did so b'mezi, intentionally, so the rectified produce or dough is prohibited by virtue of rabbinic penalty until after Shabbos. That means we are goyzer that you can't use the dough or what was baked from the dough until after Shabbos. If it was done b'shogeg, there's no penalty, then the item can still be eaten. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Im over v'hifrish b'mezid, lo yochel bein lo bein lachem ad motzei Shabbos. The person who did it or other people cannot eat from what was baked from it. Forget about Shabbos, but on Yom Tov, where you could bake the dough into bread, you wouldn't be able to eat the bread until after Yom Tov. Obviously, on Shabbos you can't bake, so it's not really relevant for Shabbos. But because we know you could be mafresh challah, it could work on Shabbos, because we can mafresh challah even after something was baked. It doesn't have to be separated from the dough. So let's say you baked something, but you recognize that you didn't give challah, and you separate the challah b'mezid on Shabbos, you wouldn't be able to eat that bread until after Shabbos. Mitam knas. But v'may b'shogeg mutar afilu lo miyad. If you did it b'shogeg, it's permitted. The Bir Halacha, which is the Mishnah Berurah, notes that the Shulchan Aruch generally accepts the view of Rabbi Yehuda, according to whom one may not benefit from the result of a prohibited act on Shabbos, known as Ma'aser Shabbos, until after Shabbos, even if the action was performed b'shogeg. This issue is a subject to Machlokas Tanoim. That means someone does something prohibited on Shabbos and something is created, are you allowed to benefit from that? So Rabbi Yehuda says no, until after Shabbos. And normally Shulchan Aruch follows Rabbi Yehuda. If so, we should be stringent in this case of separating Truma Challah as well, and forbid the food even b'shogeg until after Shabbos. Nevertheless, the Bir Halacha argues, based on the Gra, that this does not apply in our case, and the Shulchan Aruch would also be lenient when the original prohibition is only Rabbanan, right? The Rabbi Yehuda in the Gemara is talking about malachas on Shabbos that you do on Shabbos. So there, whether you did it b'mezid or b'shogeg, Rabbi Yehuda paskins that you can't benefit from it until after Shabbos, and normally Shulchan Aruch paskins that way. But here, the prohibition was rabbinic, right? Being Masakin, he said it was just a rabbinic prohibition. So that's why if you did it b'shogeg, there's no knas. Says the Bir Halacha, Matzati b'Bir Agra, shekazu v'meisik la'achad v'ila dasa Shulchan Aruch shepasuk Rabbi Yehuda. That's hainu b'doraisa. That's if you violated a malacha midoraisa on Shabbos. And then the question, for example, you bake the bread on Shabbos. Are you allowed to eat it? Let's say you bake the bread b'shogeg. You thought it was permitted, and then they tell you afterwards, you know what? Wasn't permitted on Shabbos because it's a malacha and you didn't know. Well, the din is, according to Rabbi Yehuda, since it's a malacha midoraisa, you cannot eat that bread until after Shabbos. And in fact, you have to wait. If you did it b'mezid, yasun, some say you can. For that person, you could never benefit from it. It's just a chayrim. That's not our sugi here. But we see a clear distinction between violating something midrabanan on Shabbos b'shogeg, where it seems from the Gra, who sofer the lo kansu shogeg got too mezid, and behavior is as sugis mefarashos, and various cases were brought to substantiate that. So, in order to ensure that one does not forget to separate challah before Shabbos, because in general women baked challah on Friday. So, to remind our wives, the Mishnah in Shabbos states that a man should gently ask his household members if they have separated the necessary ties before Shabbos began. We say it in Bameh Madlikin. Shlosha dvarim tzarich adam lomer b'soch beiso erev Shabbos and chashecha. A husband's supposed to say quietly in the home before Shabbos, Isartem, have you given Trumas and Maestras? Have you taken Challah? A Ravtem, have you made an Eruv? Yidliko Saner. And then to remind them to light the candle. The Shulchan Aruch records this enactment as well, and specifically mentions separating Challah in addition to separating Trumas and Maestras. The Shulchan Aruch and Orach Chaim by Dinei Shabbos in Siman Reish Samech, which talks about preparations prior to Shabbos, says K'shiyasomach l'chashecha, as Shabbos is coming in, Yishal anshe beis b'loshen raka. He should ask softly, Isartem, Iravtem, Ifrashtem Challah, did you separate Challah? And then V'yomer lahem adlik v'saner. And then he would say, he'd give a command, okay, now you can light the candles. So despite the importance of performing these actions before Shabbos, the Gemara in Gittin emphasizes that a person should inquire gently about them so that his family members will listen and comply with his request. You can't be a dictator. You have to ask softly. You have to say them calmly, softly, so that people will accept it from him. Okay. What about the nitty-gritty of hafrashas challah? How are we mafresh challah? What do we do? What bracha do we say? Right? In this section, we will discuss the specific steps used to properly fulfill the mitzvah of hafrashas challah. The Ben Ish Chai mentions a custom that some perform of giving tzedakah even before beginning the actual hafrasha process. Yesh noshin noagos loses prutos l'tzedakah kodem hafrashas challah. Some women give tzedakah. My wife has a custom of always giving tzedakah before hadlakas neiros on Shabbos. Not sure I think she got that from her grandmother. According to Tfilas mitzvah, they also give tzedakah before they go to the mikveh. Ve'hadlokas haner. So you see, it's a Ben Ish Chai who says that women also give tzedakah prior to hadlokas haner. V'simonam chana. The way to remember is chana, chala, nida, hadlaka. Always to give tzedakah before those actions. Now, what bracha do we make by hafrashas chala? Another important aspect of mitzvah is the recitation of the bracha and the position in which one recites it. That means you have to be standing. Can you do it sitting? The Piskei Tshuva cites the Mogen Avram, who writes that it is permitted to recite it while sitting, though he notes that others do not allow it when standing is possible. Says the Piskei Tshuva on your deya, V'ayin b'Mogen Avram Siman Ches, shekosov the Hafrashas Chala eina mitzvah kol kach, the Hafrashas Chala eina mitzvah kol kach. It's not such a formal mitzvah. The eina osa el takin machala. It's only done to fix the food that you want to eat. It's not like a mitzvah that stands on its own, like Sfiras HaOmer or Netilas Lulav, right? Here, the mitzvah of challah is to permit you to eat the dough. That's what the Mogen Avraham says, that you could make the bracha sitting. But Ayin Sham B'Sefer Yeshus Yaakov Shedocha Zev V'Machalek. He says the Heichad Efshar Lasos B'Mida Enu Shalei Liyos B'Yeshiva. If it's possible to stand, you should stand. Lacha B'Tzitzis Mavarch Mumid. That's why when you make tzitzis and you put the tzitzis on, you should do it standing. I'm reading the footnote. The Piskei Tshuva notes that the Shulchan Aruch also implies that the hafrasha and bracha may be performed while sitting, since he says that technically a woman may recite the bracha on the hafrasha while unclothed if she is seated, since the portions of her body that are considered erva will be covered and facing the floor. So it's not just the bracha that could be done, but even the hafrasha itself. Commentators also dispute the correct formulation of the bracha. According to the Rambam, the proper text is lahafrish challah. It seems that the Rambam holds that the word challah refers to the actual dough that is separated. Kolamafish challah, b'varach t'chil hasheg t'shem mitzvah tzivanu lahafrish challah. Bein ba'aretz, bein b'chutz la'aretz. U'chashem she'b'varach al tahara, kach b'varach al t'meh. And if you make it both on a tahor dough and an impure dough. The smag, right, the Sefer Mitzvahs Gedolos, on the other hand, holds that one should say lahafrish truma, as in his opinion, the word challah actually refers to the entire dough that you're trying to permit, while the small piece that is separated and that was given to the Kohen in earlier times is called truma, similar to actual truma. Says the smag, yeshem avorchim lahafrish truma. Ki challah shem ugehi. The challah is the main dough. So the Shulchan Aruch rules in accordance with the smag, while the Ramah allows using the text recommended by the Rambam. So says the Shulchan Aruch, b'shah sheyafrish challah yivarech, asher kinshah mitzvah of sivan la'afrish truma. Oh, la'afrish challah. That's the Ramah. The Aruch HaShulchan concludes that even Ashkenazim, right, who normally follow the Ramah, should preferably use the version recommended by the Shulchan Aruch of lahafrish truma. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, kulam iskimu, the Yosher Tov loymar lahafrish truma. Ki d'chsiv challah tarimu truma. He quotes the Shach and the Beis Yosef. The challah hu shema uga. Challah is the word for the big dough that you're correcting. Therefore, it has nothing to do with saying the word of the bracha, which is what the Drisha says. Some say lafrish challah as the nusach, and the erev Pesach mavarchin trumas challah, and then they say on the erev Pesach trumas challah. The tzak also shein chiluk ben Pesach cholim asashah. What's the difference between Pesach and the rest of the year? L'chein yiskimu kol hagdolim, Shach, Taz, Mogen Avraham, that you shouldn't make a different bracha Erev Pesach versus the rest of the year. And it looks like there's Aruch HaShulchan is noita towards saying the bracha la'afresh truma. So despite the Aruch HaShulchan's recommendation, the Mishpatei Eretz notes that the prevalent minhag nowadays among Ashkenazim is to say Asher Kiddushanim Mitzvos V'Tzivan L'Hafresh Challah. Though some do use the text of the Shulchan Aruch. Says the Mishpatei Eretz, Mevarach Baruch Atah Shalokeinu V'Choylon, Asher Kiddushanim Mitzvos V'Tzivan L'Hafresh Challah. V'Yeshonim L'Hafresh Truma. V'Yeshu Nogu Lomer L'Hafresh Challah Min Ha'isa. So Hatasham Kosov Shenogu Lomer L'Hafresh Challah Min Ha'isa. That was the Taz. Ach Kosov Shema Shulchan Aruch Lo Tzarech Lomer Min Ha'isa. But the Shulchan Aruch didn't say that. L'Hafresh Challah, enough. Shelo tzarech laskir prati hamitzvah. You don't have to go into the details. Omnam nusach zeh kosuv b'rimbat v'rosh u'piskei Challah Rashba b'kach b'seder Beis Yaakov b'inyonim mitzvahs matzos. Okay, so the standard custom is to say L'Hafresh Challah. A third custom also exists concerning the text of the bracha. The Kaf HaChaim suggests using the formulation of L'Hafresh Challah Truma. And this version has been adopted by most Sfardim and was endorsed by Rav Ovadia Yosef. Umiyu Nira, the Nochel Nom L'Hafresh Challah Truma, Kalishna Dekra, Challah Tarimu Truma, V'chein Kosav Ben Ishchai. So that's what the Sfardim do. Now, how much dough do you have to separate from the mass of dough to fulfill the mitzvah of Hafrashas Challah? Right, the next step of the process, because you always make a bracha before you do the action, right? We don't shake the lulav. First we make the bracha. We make all brachas over lasiyosim prior to the action. First you make a bracha, then you put your tefillin on. You make a bracha, then you shake the lulav. Make a bracha, then you read the Megillah. You make a bracha, then you blow shofar. Same thing here. You make the bracha, then you're mafresh challah. The next step of the process of Hafrosha, following the recital of the bracha, is to determine how much of the dough one must separate to fulfill the mitzvah. The Rambam notes that according to the Torah, no minimum amount exists, and one may separate even a minute piece of dough. Mitzvahs say L'Hafresh Truma and Ha'isa l'Kohen, Shenema Reishis Arisoseichem Challah Tarimu Truma, V'Reishis Zu Ein Lo Shir Min HaTorah, Afilu hifrish kashir kiseora potter sa'isa. Even if you separate the size of a barley bean, you fulfill the mitzvah of Hafrashas Challah Min HaTorah. Chazal imposed a minimum amount by rabbinic law, which is to separate 1/24 of the dough if you're making bread at home, or 1/48 if one is a professional baker. And that it says that in the Mishnah in Challah. Shira Challah, the amount that you have to separate is Echad Me'esrim Ba'arba 1/24. Ha'osa Isa La'atzmo, if you're making bread for yourself at home, or Osa L'Mishta B'no, you're making a wedding at home for your son, is Echad Me'esrim Ba'arba. But Nachdom, a baker, Shu Osa Limkor Bashuk, who's baking bread to sell in the market, or the Chena Isha Shehi Osa Limkor Bashuk. You have a lot of these women today that bake challah and sell it, right? Echad Marboy Mushmona. When they make, they have to give 1/48. Nowadays, though, the challah separate is not given to a kohen because all are assumed to be tomei mace, ritually impure from a corpse, and challah may not be consumed by one who is tomei. Says the footnote, the reason that all are assumed to be tomei mace today is that we do not have the ashes of the paraduma that are necessary for the purification process. Moreover, even those who have not actively been in contact with a corpse, such as a kohen, are still assumed to become tomei through transmission of tumah from others who came in contact with a corpse. So if the challah cannot be consumed by a kohen because they're tomei, we have a custom not to give it to the kohanim. Instead, the challah is burnt. And there are more rights that the custom is to separate a kazayas only, regardless of how much dough is being baked. Says the Ramah, they take a kazayas, that's the amount. However, the Birka Yosef quotes the Arizal that even nowadays, one should separate the proper amount, though the Birka Yosef acknowledges that in his time, no one followed that practice. V'ra'iti lemoran b'sefer Bedek Abayis, that was Rav Yosef Karo, shekosav v'zel shono, kosav Barchas Chaim, ein shir l'chala, rak b'zman shi noisim l'kohen. There's no shir except when they gave it to a kohen. Nostu b'chachamim shir, then the chachamim came up with the shirim. Ve'ein kein dasa Rambam, but the Rambam didn't hold like that. Shekosav perakei me'ilchas bikurim, echad b'mem ches v'sorf nosah, 148, you burn it. The kosavod bizman hazeh she'enisa tahor b'nei tumas meis. In our time where the dough is not tar because of tumah, mafrishin chala achas b'chol eretz Yisrael achas b'mem ches. 148 is the shear. The sorf nosah v'achik naktina nakam l'shono. But the yesh makam lomar, the ain't a soiser minhag hapashut. But the statement of the Rambam there is not perhaps really against our minig, where our minig is lahafrish kolshu. There's a minimum she take a little bit. And everybody agrees. These shiurim only existed when it was still the minig to give it to a kohen. V'am tulachti ma'asim Maran the Rambam kosav that feel kishasarfnus like yesh lo shir echad marba'im shmona. There's a davke in return lafish kishir achinakin. So if somebody wants to be mafresh the shir, the after the sreifa azla, he says that even if you're going to burn it, yafish echad mimem ches 148. Aval mrotz lafish kol shuayid the sreifa azla rishus biyodo. He says the rishus is in the person to be mafresh even a small amount. Amnam Rabbeinu ha'ari. Because of the gamatad the l'sreifa azla, if you're going to burn it, yidag de kulotzi echad mimem ches 148. Lefi sodan shel, it's a secret. It's because of kabbalistic reasons. Ayin shama v'lo ra'iti v'lo shamati sheshum chasid b'doreinu no'ad kach. He says, I don't know any chasidim or great tzaddikim that in our generation separated 148. So the Yaakov Yosef writes that one may separate a small amount, even lechatchila. But once a year, one should try to separate 1/24 in accordance with the Arizal. Technically, you've corrected the dough even with a little bit. According to Chachamim, it should be 1/24. Ulam bizman hazeh she'echla asura b'achila l'kohanim b'nei hatumah. But today, there's an issur to eat it. B'chala b'lavach in Israel, we burn it, and therefore notlim chala kolshu. We just give a little bit. Be'ein tzarich lachmer litol echad. We're not required to be machmer to take 148. However, he says nochon lachmer lafrish pamachas b'shana shir chala echad mechavdal kedas arizal. He says, to fulfill what the Arizal said, you could do it once a year. Because the Ramah said kazayis. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach was quoted in Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa, Rav Neumer, that the Ashkenazic custom to separate a kazayis applies only to a large amount of dough, but not when separating from a small amount, from which challah had not been previously separated, though it came from a larger amount that was subject to the obligation. So now when you have the smaller piece of dough, you don't have to take a kazayis, take even less, right? Shamati Magon Rav Shlomo Zalman, Zerak Mafish Misak Dola, a kazayis. Aval Abol Sakin Rak Lechem Echad Matzak, making one small bread. Shalakach Mi Kamus Gdola that was taken from a larger dough. Shekvar Nischayv B'Chala, and there was a chiyuv challah on a larger dough. Kigon Hakona LeHamniya Achas Ben Chanus, right? You bought But you bought a big challah from a store, but you suspect that maybe challah wasn't taken. So you don't have to separate a kazayas. You separate a little barley bean, and that's enough. Let's say for some reason you're chashash, even after you bought a loaf of bread, they didn't give challah, you could always do that. Now again, lechatchila, one should cite the bracha before separating the challah, since the general principle given by the Gemara and Psachim is that one should recite a bracha on all mitzvahs prior to their performance. And this principle is recorded within the context of Truma by the Shulchan Aruch and the Shach. It says the Shulchan Aruch, Hamafrish Truma Gedola, or Truma Smaiser Mavarch Koidim Shiyafrish. You make the bracha prior to separating. It says the Shach, Koidim Shiyafrish T'chol HaMitzvahs Mavarch Aleim Oiver Lasiyosim. He gives us the general rule that we always make the bracha before we do the act. Following the bracha, one should separate the piece of dough taken as challah, and then one should declare that this is challah. The Mishratei Eretz then discusses the halacha concerning one who forgot to recite the bracha. Mevarech v'lokech chatichas b'nefach kazayis. You take a piece of kazayis. He says it's the size of a box of matches in Eretz Yisrael. Mina bot seker mina mafeh, even from the bread that was baked. The Yeshavim shoylon areza challah, areza truma. And then if you forgot to make the bracha and you already koveya this piece is challah, then you can't make the bracha. But what you did worked. And it corrected the dough or the baked thing so you can eat it. The bracha is not, does not ma'akev. Does not ruin the process. Now, what do you do with the challah? As noted above, the challah is burnt, since everyone is assumed to be in a state of impurity, in which challah like truma may not be eaten. Shulchan Aruch says, "B'nan hazeh shein isa tahora neituma sameis mafrishin challah v'sorfno," so you burn it. According to Ramah, the challah is customarily burnt in the oven before baking the bread. That's as opposed to during the baking, to ensure the challah, that piece that you took off, which has the status of teva, which is prohibited, does not render the bread forbidden. Meaning, if you baked it, if you tried to burn that small piece of challah with your bread, so until it burns, the time and everything is going into the bread, it'll asur your bread. You take a small piece, the sorfinos, and you burn it. You throw it in the fire, in the oven, before you bake your bread. However, nowadays, most ovens do not consist of a fire alone, in which one can simply dump the challah in there by burning it directly. Consequently, one who places the challah in the oven confronts a problem that it may render the oven non-kosher before getting burned due to its forbidden status. A number of different customs exist today as to how to avoid this problem when burning the challah. One suggestion is to place it on the stovetop, such that the fire will burn the challah immediately, and this does not render the stovetop non-kosher while burning. And the Sefer Kashrus mentions this. Another suggestion is wrapping the challah dough in thick aluminum foil and placing it in the oven. In this manner, it would not render the oven or food inside non-kosher. Nevertheless, the Sefer Kashrus cites the Avnei Yoshpa, who does not approve of this method, since the challah may not be burned properly inside the foil. The meaning is to burn the challah on the stovetop, or to put it in the oven that you're baking, but not when you're baking it at the same time. The Rav Gansreich, who wrote the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, followed the Ramah and said you should burn the challah prior to baking the bread. That was their ovens, where they had a burning fire. You could throw in the fire; it was consumed in a few seconds. Our ovens don't have fire. Because otherwise our ovens will absorb from the prohibited status of this piece of challah, become prohibited. Katuv, She'ein l'smoch al atifat hachala b'niar aluminum. You should not rely on putting that piece into aluminum because he's concerned it's not going to burn properly. The OU offers the following suggestions on how to dispose of the challah dough. What do I do with the challah? Preferably, one should put the challah into an open fire until it's completely burned. The Ramah records the practice of burning the challah in the fire inside the oven before baking bread. Since this is not very practical in modern ovens, one possible alternative is to place a small piece of dough in the middle of a burner on a gas stovetop for a few minutes until it's burned to a crisp. It goes without saying that care must be taken to avoid fire. Alternatively, one can place the piece of dough into the oven until it's completely burned. When doing so, it is important to keep in mind a few important points. It's best to burn the challah in the oven uncovered in order to make sure that the challah is completely burned. However, since the challah is not permitted to be eaten by a non-Kohen, we cannot allow any of the taste of the challah to come in contact with the food that we eat. As such, one should not place it directly on the broiler where one broils livers or on the oven rack. Rather, one should place the challah on a dedicated challah burning tray on a piece of aluminum foil and leave it in the oven until it's completely burnt. Some wrap the challah dough in a piece of aluminum foil. The disadvantage of doing so, that will take a very long time for the dough to be properly burned. If it's not possible to burn the challah appropriately, some poskim, such as the Minchas Yitzchak, allow a third option of placing it inside a plastic bag and disposing of it in the garbage. Alvar challah nitel b'bayis. If you take challah home, she'ein sham tanu, so you don't have a good oven to burn it. Heich yitnagu, how should they act? Im mechuyav lasos medur b'chatzeiram or b'chav l'sorfo. Maybe you have to set up a bonfire like we do Erev Pesach when we burn the chametz. Maybe we should set something up outside or in the front yard and burn it. But that's a davar kasha. That's pretty hard to do. Oh, can you throw it into the garbage can that's in front of the house? Which is eventually going to be taken by the garbage trucks outside the city. And some of the garbage is burned. However, where they throw it in the ocean. Maybe that's not appropriate because it's a bizoyon. And you're not burning it. But nobody's going to come to eat it, which is a problem because we don't want people to eat it. It's not kosher for non-Kohanim to eat it. But nobody's going to eat it if it's thrown in the garbage because it's disgusting. So the Minchas Yitzchak is arriving at the psak. The Vada Yatzorch l'sor from Davka. Kamosha Kosav Kovad Aderes Gaono Nero Yoyer. You should burn it if you can. If you can't burn it, Yesh Lomar. The B'shas Afrosha, when you separate, you should say Shepachos Tzas V'Kazayis Yel Chalav Vadai. That even only a kazayah should be chalav vadai. The other will only be technically challah if you can come to burn it. So with that t'nai, there's no bizayon, and you take care of it. You can put it in a paper and put it in the garbage can. The Yalkut Yosef offers the same suggestion and notes that even if one does burn it, the remnants may still be disposed of in the garbage for it. Let's say you burn the challah and you have the crispy thing, you can still throw it away in the garbage. You can't burn it, wrap it in a paper and throw it away. Just like after you burn the challah, we can throw it in the garbage. So the mitzvah of burning was done. And therefore, what happens if one separates challah, but then accidentally mixes it into the rest of the dough, or places it into the oven uncovered with the dough? Has one rendered the oven and the dough non-kosher? The Ramah writes that in such a case, one may actually perform a type of hataris nedorim, permitting a vow upon the challah, which essentially retroactively undoes the hafrasha. One may then separate challah a second time from a different piece of dough. In order to save your bread that's baking in the oven, you can undo your original hafrasha. Remember, when you say arezu challah, so in a sense, you've had a declaration of a shame, similar to when you say arezu shlomim. When you take an animal, you say this will be a shlomim. Now you can go to a chacham and matir your neder and say, if you would have known blah, 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 and then therefore he makes the neder go away. And therefore the cow is not hegdish anymore. So that's basically what the Ramah is saying here as well. If otherwise the dough, challah, now what happened was you separated challah, for some reason got mixed back to the regular dough and you baked it. The whole challah otherwise would be usr. So what you do is you have a hataris nedorm of the hafrasha that you did. So now it's as if that piece is a regular piece of dough, and if you have more dough left over, you're mafresh challah from the other dough, right? Now, if you have 1 to 100, right? Then there's bittul, because truma is bittul without 1 in 100, not 1 in 60. So if it's 1 in 100, there's bittul. Im lo achala isa, yishar l'chacham aleha. If you haven't finished or used up the remaining dough, you can ask a chacham to be matir the original neder you made, v'yatir lo keneder, the nishalim alay deshos, like you can ask a shaila on, like I said, a rezu shlomi, v'yachzor v'yitel challah and separate challah from the other dough. Rav Ovadia Yosef comments that one should not recite a bracha on the second hafrasha, right? In such a case, if you were matir neder and you were mafresh a second time, you shouldn't make a bracha. Since if one does so, it becomes clear retroactively that the first bracha was levatala. Right? There's not enough for nullification. I wonder, therefore he says, when you separate the challah the second time, don't make a bracha. V'chein nira b'shut tzitza kodesh, v'chein posik b'shut hari b'samim, ayin sham v'chein nikr. A related question arises with regard to one who did not separate challah before the bread or other food was baked. Right? Normally we're mafresh challah in the status of a dough before you bake it. But let's say it was baked and then you're told, no challah was given. In that case, we learned in the first year that one may still perform the hafrasha afterwards. Though in Israel, it must be done before one eats from it. Remember, we said outside of Eretz Yisrael, you could eat from it and then still be mafresh. Right? The Sefri HaReish lo yifresh chal ben ha'isa, shomei anish lo yifresh chal ben ha'lechem, Talmud Lamer, vayabach lechem yilechem haaretz, b'kol makom. That even after you baked it into a bread, you can be mafresh challah. Im lo yifresh challah botzek, elo afa hakol, or is a mafresh ben hapas, you can be mafresh challah even from the bread itself. If the challah got lost before being burned, let's say for kashrus rules, when it's fulfilled one's obligation, you don't have to separate a second hafrasha. Frisha challah v'nevda was lost. Gon shaloka tinok, a child, or achla balachem, or a dog ate it. The fish is sprinkled so he didn't burn it. You don't have to separate a second time. Let's go to Hafrashas Challah, part 3, page 223. I think we'll probably, we might finish next week, but next week we're going to learn the dinim of Chadash, which is a subject that everybody knows Chadash, but we're going to learn the details in detail about the mitzvah of Chadash. And perhaps we'll also start the laws of Trumas and Maestris and Orla in Chutz La'aretz and in Eretz Yisrael. What are the dinim today? How do we apply it? What do we do? regarding all of that. So that is what's in store for us next week. But we'll start the third shir, completing the study of the halachas of Challah, and then we'll talk about Chodesh. So what about a divided dough? In the previous shir, we discussed the question of the minimum shir for which dough is subject to the obligation of Rosh Challah. Oftentimes, a person needs dough with the intention of splitting the mass into a number of smaller portions, such that all of them will not be baked together. In the event that the original mass is large enough to be subject to Challah, but the smaller individual portions are not large enough, is there an obligation to separate Challah? And this is addressed in the Talmud Yerushalmi. If you make a big dough, but your intent is to make smaller ones, you're potter ben Challah. Vatanina naftam shasas she'or l'chalek chayav b'challah. If a baker made a sourdough, big dough, to divide it up, he is chayav in challah. So the Gemara says, Nachtom lo b'daita davar toli. It's not based on the Nachtom's idea. It's b'das lakuchos hadavar toli. It's his customers. Shemi matzah lakuchos v'uchosav also so isa. That means if he has enough customers, he'll use the dough. So l'chor the Yerushalmi seems to make a difference between privately and a baker. Says the Pnei Moshe, who is a mefarish of the Yerushalmi, v'imlo yimatzeh. If the Nachton doesn't find customers, he'll go back and bake all of it in bread, and therefore that's why he's chayiv to give challah. You'll find customers for the whole dough. So according to the Yerushalmi, an ordinary person who needs dough with intent to divide it into smaller portions is not obligated to separate challah, since the dough is intended for multiple people, each of which will not receive a sufficient amount. And the intent of how the dough will be used is the key to determining its status. This is different than a baker, who is dependent upon the needs of his customers. Since in some cases the dough will remain as one unit, he's obligated. And the Shulchan Aruch adopts this position of the Yerushalmi, that if someone needs dough for the sake of dividing it, it is potter from challah. Nachtom Shasi, that's a professional baker. La Sosa Sorla Chalka, Chayev is Bechala. He's Chayev in Challah. Shemoti Yasen and Pas. If he doesn't sell the doughs, he'll make them into bread. Aval Sha'ar, but private people, Ha'osa Isa, who makes dough, Chalka B'Botze, with the intent of selling it or giving it out to friends or making smaller doughs, then that dough would be P'tura min HaChallah. Commenting on the second one in the Shulchan Aruch, the Vilna Gaon distinguishes between the dividing the dough for one's own use, where one is still obligated. For example, you make one big dough, which is chayv, then you separate them and you freeze them for future use, but you're going to use them. So certainly that's going to be a chiyuv challah. But if you're going to give it to many people, you're going to be potter. Says the Gra, when is there a patur if you're making it for many people? But if he's going to use it himself, he's chayiv and challah. And this distinction is accepted by the Achronim, like the Piskei Tshuva. And remember, the Piskei Tshuva learned in the 1800s, and he's like the Mishnah Brura on. We don't have a Mishnah Brura on Yoredeya. We only have Mishnah Brura, the Chofetz Chaim. We only have Manor Chaim, right? The Mishnah Brura passed away in 1933. So the Piskei Tshuva is the quote unquote the Mishnah Brura for Yoredeya. That means, what did the Mishnah Brura and Or Chaim do? The Shach and the Taz lived in the 1600s. By the time of the Mishnah Brura, who passed away in 1933, there were many other poskim, the Levush, and the Eliyah Rabbah, many other later Achronim, who had added to the corpus of halacha. So if the Mishnah Brura told us, okay, this is how we have to fear Zach in Izman. So the Mishnah Brura caught us up to modern times, at least up until his time. Of course, since since the Mishnah Berurah passed away, we have many Achronim, Rav Moshe, Shlomo Zalman. So the corpus of halacha has grown, but nobody has written a new Mishnah Berurah. And same thing with the Pischei Tshuva. There is no, if you open up a Shulchan Aruch and you see the Ordeya, the Pischei Tshuva is the most recent commentary, just like the Mishnah Berurah in general is the most recent commentary on Orach Chaim. So the Pischei Tshuva said, and noted, Kotzva Levush, right? So the Levush is one of the main Achronim that the Mishnah Berurah comments a lot as well. Vadrisha Ubach, the Dafkim wrote to L'chakala Noshim Harbe. That the P'tur of Challah is only if he wants to separate the dough to many people. Then it's not considered that there's a P'tur. Okay, so we'll stop here. I think we covered a lot of ground. And I think we'll probably certainly finish Challah next week, and then we'll learn Chadash. And if we finish Chadash, we'll start with Trumas and Maestros. Any comments, questions, He'oros?